Lecture 25, and the title of this lecture is the control of muscle tension and muscle metabolism. Control of muscle tension. The tension or the force of the muscle contraction is usually variable. It is not the same all the time. We have multiple degrees of contraction present in the muscle, and the maximum tension or force of contraction is dependent on number one, the rate at which nerve impulse arrive at the neuromuscular junction, or we can mention it the frequency of stimulation of the muscle. 2. Amount of stretch before contraction. Amount of stretch before contraction. And we studied this in length-tension relationship. The nutrient and oxygen availability, or the ability of the muscle to form adequate amount of ATP. Nutrient and oxygen availability. The total tension depends on the number of the muscles that are contracting together. This means that not all the muscle fibers are contracting at the same time. We can find 50% of the muscle fibers are contracting and the other 50% are relaxing. In another situation, 60 to 40% or 70 to 30%. So regarding to the amount of the contracting muscle fibers or the number of the contracting muscle fiber, the muscle tension will be detected or the muscle tension will appear inside the muscle. Motor unit. We defined previously what is the meaning of the motor unit. It is a motor neuron coming from the anterior horn cells or from the cranial motor nuclei in the brainstem, plus the muscle fiber supplied by this motor neuron. And we mention this part as a motor unit. And regarding to the type of, or according to the type of contraction produced by the muscle, is it producing a scaled movement? So in this condition, the motor neuron is supplying a few number of muscle fibers. If the muscle like the biceps or the quadriceps or the gastrocnemius muscles, whatever, they are going to produce gross movement. In this condition, the motor neuron will supply huge number of muscle fiber. The total strength of contraction depends on the size of the motor unit and the number that are activated. That means that the degree of tension or the force of contraction produced by the muscle is dependent on the size of the motor units and the number that are activated. Motor unit recruitment. What is the meaning of motor unit recruitment? It is the process at which the number of motor unit increase is called recruitment. We have here a motor unit X composed of this motor neuron plus 5 muscle fibers. We have here motor unit Y consists of the motor neuron Y and the 7 muscle fibers. When you are going to produce simultaneous activation of both motor units, you get activation of 12 muscle fibers. That is the meaning of recruitment. An increase in the force is made possibly by recruiting more motor units. Muscles have various sizes of motor units, allow them to adjust the size of the effort to be made. So according to the degree of activation, according to the degree of activation of the motor unit, the degree of contraction of the muscle will be affected. Activating the motor unit alternatively allows the muscle to sustain contraction with minimal fatigue. And that's usually occur in the muscles that contract for long times, like muscles of the back, muscles of the side. If you are going to stand for a long time, what's going? We have alternation between the contracting and relaxing muscle fiber, and this resists the effect of fatigue and prevent the development of fatigue in skeletal muscles. One of the factors that make smooth movements and precise movement is produced by small motor units. Precise movement or skilled movement is produced by small motor units. Control of muscle tension. We have here another term which is called summation. We have here the action potential generated in the skeletal muscle, and if we go and stimulate the skeletal muscle during the process of relaxation, the muscle is going to produce another action potential and go to produce another contraction and relaxation. If we go and produce frequent stimulation by multiple frequent stimuli, what's going, the muscle can produce something which is called unfused tetanus. And if we increase the frequency more, allowing the muscle to be stimulated during a contraction, the muscle is going to produce something which is called fused tetanus. Fused tetanus. So, rapid sequence of stimuli or increasing the frequency of the stimuli, and with this increase in the frequency of stimuli, we are going to stimulate the muscle during the contraction. What's going? The muscle is going to show increase in the force of contraction or continuous contraction without relaxation with then a more strong contraction than the previous. So the meaning of that, the second contraction is better than the first, the third is better than the second, and it's due to calcium accumulation. Due to calcium accumulation. What is the definition of tetanus? Continuous contraction without relaxation due to stimulation of the skeletal muscle by impulses during what? During the contraction phase. If you stimulate the muscle during relaxation, you get unfused tetanus. But stimulation of the muscle during the contraction produce fused tetanus. Types of contraction. We have two types of skeletal muscle contraction. Number one, isotonic contraction. What's the meaning of isotonic contraction? The muscle is going to increase its tension, and then the tension become fixed to move that weight, and is associated with muscle shortening. Associated with muscle shortening, and usually done for moving, for lifting or carrying light to moderate weights. Second type of contraction is isometric contraction, in which the muscle is going to produce what? Is going to produce increase in the tension without shortening, and this usually appear when the muscle try to carry or move a heavy weight. Types of skeletal muscle contraction. When you are holding the book in this condition without change of its position, that is the isometric contraction. If you move the book against the effect of gravity, you are producing shortening of the muscle. So the tension increase until you can move the book, and what's going? There is shortening in the muscle, and the type of contraction is concentric contraction. Here you are going to move the book, but with the direction of gravity, in the direction of the gravity. So what's going? You are going to produce another type of contraction, which is called eccentric contraction. And this eccentric contraction to slow down the movement, of the gravity. So this type of contraction is known as eccentric contraction. Eccentric contraction. Muscle 2. We have to compare between something which is called voluntary contraction of the skeletal muscle. When you are carrying a weight, when you are lifting something, what's going? You have a degree of contraction present in the muscle. This is the active contraction. But you have another type of contraction, which is a passive contraction. This passive contraction is produced in response to stretch reflex or in response to stimulation of the muscle spindle. So any muscle in your body now has a degree of contraction which is known as the muscle tone. Small groups of motor units are alternatively active and inactive in a constantly shifting pattern to sustain the degree of contraction or to sustain the muscle tone. Muscle tone keeps skeletal muscle firm. Muscle tone prevents the head from slumping forward on the chest. Muscle tone produces closure of the mouth. Muscle tone maintains the venous return, maintains the lymphatic drainage. All these are functions of the muscle tone. Also, muscle tone with this maintained contraction produces thermogenesis to maintain the body temperature. But exposure to cold, the muscle tone is going to increase. Exposure to hot weather, the muscle tone is going to decrease. So the muscle tone is a degree of contraction present in the muscle, and this is usually occur reflexly, involuntarily. But how do we know how big or how small the contraction are. How do we protect our muscles from overstretch? Proper control of the muscle function require continuous feedback of sensory information from each muscle to the spinal cord. This means the contraction or the degree of the muscle tone or the degree of the muscle contraction is dependent on what sensory feedback coming from the muscle itself, coming from the receptors located in the muscle itself. And muscle sensory receptors. Muscle sensory receptor. We have two types of receptor in the muscle spindle, sensory receptor within the skeletal muscle. They detect muscle length and the changes in the muscle length and convey information to the central nervous system. Golgi tendon organ, it is a proprioceptor also, it's a sensory receptor located mainly in the tendon. They found to produce detection of the muscle tension and the changes in the muscle tension. So these are the two receptors that's going to control the degree of muscle contraction or the degree of muscle. In this figure, we have muscle length, that is the initial muscle length, then the muscle length is increased. This means that the muscle is stretched. Consequently, when the muscle is stretched, the action potential in the muscle spindle were going to what? Are going to increase to be parallel with the degree of stretch. When the muscle returns back to its original length, the degree of stimulation of the muscle spindle decrease. Muscle stretch increase afferent signals to the spinal cord. Spinal cord stimulation increase efferent output through the alpha motor neuron. This will produce muscle contraction. When the muscle contract, this will produce negative feedback on the stretch reflex. Muscle reflexes help to prevent inflammation. We have here the stretch reflex. When you apply load on the hand, you stretch the muscle. So what's going? The degree of contraction in the muscle will increase to allow you to hold the weight. That's called the load reflex. But if the load increase progressively beyond the capacity of the muscle, so in this condition, the muscle being overstretched with active contraction, being overstretched by this overload and the muscle contraction. This will stimulate in this condition the Golgi tendon organ, and the Golgi tendon organ send afferent impulses to inhibit the alpha motor neuron producing muscle relaxation, to produce muscle relaxation. So again, stretch will produce muscle contraction. This is called the stretch reflex or the load reflex. Overstretch with increase in the muscle tension was going to stimulate the Golgi tendon organ and produce muscle relaxation. Production of ATP in muscle fiber. Production of ATP in muscle fibers. As we mentioned before, the muscle needs ATP during a contraction and relaxation. 4. The power of contraction cycle, the cross-bridge cycling. With each cross-bridge cycling, we have hydrolysis of the ATP, pump calcium into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. The ATP inside the muscle fiber will power contraction for only a few seconds. This means that the stored ATP inside the muscle is sufficient for few seconds only. In order to that, ATP must be produced by the muscle fibers after reserves are used up. So the muscle needs to regenerate a huge amount of ATP suitable or sufficient for the maintenance of the muscle contraction and relaxation. Muscle fiber have three ways to produce ATP: from creatine phosphate, by anaerobic cellular respiration, by aerobic cellular respiration. Those are the three ways used by the muscle to produce ATP: from creatine phosphate, by anaerobic respiration, by aerobic respiration, or excess ATP is used to synthesize creatine phosphate, which is an energy-rich molecule. Creatine phosphate transfers its high-energy phosphate group to ATP to regenerate new ATP. When the ATP is depleted inside the muscle, the creatine phosphate will give the high-energy phosphate bond to the ADP and recreate ATP again, and this ATP will be used by the muscle. Creatine phosphate and the ATP provide enough energy for contraction for about 15 seconds. So during relaxation, ATP will synthesize creatine phosphate, and then during the contraction, the creatine phosphate gives the phosphate bond or the high energy phosphate bond to the ATP to regenerate ATP. This amount of creatine phosphate sufficient to produce contraction of the muscle for about 15 seconds. When the muscle produce or need large amount of energy with absence of oxygen or insufficient supply of oxygen, the muscle is going to produce energy from the anaerobic oxidation or the anaerobic glycolysis, where the glucose gives two molecules of ATP, plus 2 pyruvic acid that's going to be transformed into lactic acid. So muscle glycogen go into or transformed into the glucose. This will go outside the mitochondria and gives 2 ATP and 2 pyruvic acid. This is going to be changed or transformed into lactic acid. Glucose is used to regenerate or generate ATP when the supply of creatine phosphate is depleted. Glucose either derived from the blood and from the glycogen stored in the muscle fibers. Glycolysis breaks down glucose into molecules of pyruvic acid and produce 2 molecules of ATP. If sufficient oxygen is present, pyruvic acid formed by glycolysis enter the aerobic respiration pathways, producing large amount of ATP. If there is sufficient oxygen, this pyruvic acid will be shifted inside the mitochondria to the Krebs cycle to form large amount of ATP. If oxygen levels are low, an aerobic reaction converts pyruvic acid to lactic acid, which is carried away by the blood. Anaerobic respiration can provide enough energy for about 30 to 40 seconds of muscle activity. Anaerobic respiration can provide enough energy for about 30 to 40 seconds of muscle activity. ATP production from aerobic respiration. ATP production from aerobic respiration. Here we have ATP produced by the mitochondria. ATP is produced by the oxidation of pyruvic acid from the glycolysis. Pyruvic acid coming from glycolysis enters the mitochondria. Fatty acids liberated from adipose tissue. Fatty acids liberated from adipose tissue because there is something which is called beta oxidation of fatty acids, and this beta oxidation ends in the formation of acetyl-CoA, and this acetyl-CoA can enter inside the mitochondria and oxidized. Also, the fatty acids liberated from the adipose tissue give ketone bodies, and these ketone bodies can transferred into acetyl-CoA, enter inside the mitochondria and used for the synthesis of ATP. Oxidative deamination of amino acids may be used also for generation of ATP. So, pyruvic acid entering the mitochondria is completely oxidized to generate ATP from 36 molecules of glucose plus carbon dioxide, water, and heat. That is the pathway of glucose if there is a sufficient amount of oxygen coming from the blood supply. Muscle tissue has two sources of oxygen from are oxygen-binding protein. Muscle tissues has two sources of oxygen from oxygen-binding proteins. Number one, oxygen from hemoglobin in the blood, oxygen released from myoglobin in the muscle cell. Oxygen from hemoglobin in the blood, oxygen released by the myoglobin in the muscle cell. And the myoglobin is a protein located inside the muscles like the red muscle fibers and the cardiac muscle fiber, and this myoglobin is an oxygen store located inside the muscle where there is marked deficiency of oxygen supply. When there is marked deficiency of oxygen supply, the myoglobin located in the muscles is going to liberate the oxygen and give it to the muscle to be used for the formation of ATP, Aerobic respiration. Aerobic respiration supplies ATP for prolonged activity. Aerobic respiration provides more than 90% of the needed ATP in activities lasting more than 10 minutes. Aerobic respiration provides more than 90% of the needed ATP in activities lasting more than 10 minutes. Oxygen consumption after exercise. After the end of exercise, the subject may suffer from increase in the rate and depth of breathing, and this may continue for about 24 hours if he performed a strenuous exercise or a severe exercise. With severe exercise, heavy breathing continues and oxygen consumption remains above the resting level. The subject breathes deeply and forcefully for a long time after the end of exercise in order to get sufficient amount of oxygen. After the exercise has been finished above the normal level, above the resting level, and this is known as oxygen debt. Oxygen debt. What's the meaning of oxygen debt? It is the added oxygen that's taken into the body after exercise. It is the amount of oxygen needed by the body after the end of exercise. And this amount of oxygen is used for what? Is used to convert lactic acid into glycogen. There is a specific pathway present in the liver which is called Curie cycle. That convert lactic acid into glycogen. To synthesize creatine phosphate and ATP. To replace the oxygen removed from myoglobin. So after the end of exercise, your breathing rate will continue to be more than normal. Your breathing depth is going to continue more than normal, and this is needed to convert lactic acid into glycogen, to form creatine phosphate and ATP, and to restore oxygen again with myoglobin. Or reload the myoglobin with oxygen. Types of muscle fibers. If we look to this graph, we have here the tension developed by the muscle during the contraction. When we stimulate it by a single stimulus, that is the tension developed in the muscle. And here we have the duration or the time. We have three types of muscle fibers. We have a muscle fiber that's fast or producing fast contraction and fast relaxation. Fast contraction and fast relaxation, that's example for these muscles, the extraocular muscles, and its muscle twitch is from 7 to 8 milliseconds. We have another muscle which is slowly contracting and slowly relaxing like the soleus muscle, 90 milliseconds. And we have a muscle fiber which is moderate in or its contraction and relaxation are in between the fast muscle fibers or the slow muscle fibers, are in between the fast muscle fibers and the slow muscle fibers. That include the gastrocnemius muscle. So we have fast muscle fiber like the extraocular muscle, its muscle twitch 7 to 8 milliseconds. We have slow muscle fibers that is produce slow contraction and slow relaxation like the soleus muscle 90 milliseconds. And we have a muscle fiber which is in between the fast and the slow, and this includes the gastrocnemius muscle fiber. Gastrocnemius muscle fiber 40 milliseconds. So, types of skeletal muscle fibers. Muscle fiber, they vary in their content of myoglobin, vary in their content of the oxygen store or the protein can bind oxygen inside the muscle which is myoglobin. We have red muscle fibers, white muscle fibers. Red muscle fibers have a high myoglobin content, appear darker, contain more mitochondria, supplied by more blood capillaries. So we have group of muscle fiber known as the red muscle fibers, and they are named as red muscle fiber because of the following: contains large amount of myoglobin, contains more mitochondria, supplied by more blood capillaries. While we have another type of muscle fiber which are white muscle fiber, have low content of myoglobin, appear lighter, white meat in chicken breasts for example. And these are types of skeletal muscle fibers. Muscle fibers contract at different speeds and vary in how quickly they fatigue. We have slow oxidative fibers, and that's mainly the muscles fibers that resist fatigue. We have fast glycolytic fibers that can go rapidly into fatigue. So we have two types of muscle fiber. The first one is the slow oxidative fibers and the fast glycolytic fibers. The fast glycolytic fibers are more susceptible to fatigue than the slow oxidative fiber. And we have the third type, which is a fast oxidative glycolytic fibers. It includes a mix of between the two muscle fiber. It is a fast oxidative glycolytic fibers. Slow oxidative fibers. Slow oxidative fibers. They are smallest in diameter, least powerful type of muscle fibers, appear dark red because of more myoglobin, generate ATP mainly by aerobic respiration, have slow speed of contraction. The twitch contraction lasts from 100 to 200 milliseconds, very resistant to fatigue, capable of prolonged sustained contraction for many hours, adapted for maintaining posture and for aerobic endurance type of activities such as running a marathon. So these slow oxidative fibers are smallest in diameter, least powerful type of muscle fiber, appear dark red, generates ATP mainly by aerobic glycolysis, have slow speed of contraction, very resistant to fatigue. Why they are resistant to fatigue? They have plenty of what? They have plenty of mitochondria and they are containing large amounts of myoglobin. They are adapted for maintaining posture and performing exercise for long duration like marathon runner. Fast glycolytic fibers. Fast glycolytic fibers, largest in diameter, generate the most powerful contraction, have low myoglobin content, few blood capillaries supplying them, few mitochondria, so they can fatigue quickly. They can fatigue quickly. And the ATP is produced mainly by the anaerobic glycolysis, producing lactic acid. So They are the largest in diameter, generates powerful contraction, have low myoglobin content, supplied by few blood capillaries, contains few mitochondria, generates ATP by anaerobic glycolysis, and they contract strongly and quickly. Example for tennis muscles, the muscles used for weightlifting or throwing a ball. Weightlifting and throwing a ball. Adapted for intense anaerobic movements of short duration. Adapted for intense anaerobic movements for short duration. They are largest in diameter. Why? To store large amount of glycogen. To store large amount of glycogen to be used for the anaerobic glycolysis. Muscle fatigue. After repeated stimulation of the muscle for long duration, we have something which is a decline in the force of contraction. Decline in the force of contraction. What's the meaning of the decline in the force of contraction? We have the amplitude of contraction is going to decrease with prolonged continuous stimulation of the muscle. Inability of the muscle to maintain the force of contraction after prolonged activity is the definition of muscle fatigue. Factors that contribute to muscle fatigue. What are the factors that can cause muscle fatigue? Inadequate release of calcium ions from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Depletion of creatine phosphate. Depletion of creatine phosphate. Insufficient oxygen. Insufficient oxygen. Depletion of glycogen and other nutrients. Build up of lactic acid and ADP inside the muscle. And failure of the motor neuron to release enough acetylcholine or depletion of acetylcholine. Depletion of acetylcholine. And this factor is known as the synaptic fatigue or the neuromuscular fatigue. What's the meaning of neuromuscular fatigue? It is fatigue due to depletion of acetylcholine in the neuromuscular junction. So we have several factors contributing to the muscle fatigue, starting from the depletion of acetylcholine in the neuromuscular junction to decrease the release of calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, decrease the synthesis of ATP from creatine phosphate, decrease oxygen supply to the muscle which disturb aerobic glycolysis, depletion of glycogen and other nutrients, and build up of lactic acid and ATP. Effect of exercise on the muscle. Aerobic exercise, long sustained exercise promotes oxidative capacity of the muscle fiber, increase blood vessel supply, and increase in the mitochondria. So aerobic exercise like running, like biking, on the long term is going to change the blood supply in the muscles and the mitochondrial density inside the muscle. High intensity, like short burst exercise, increase the glycolytic activity, so they are going to increase the synthesis of the glycolytic enzymes and increase the synthesis of myofibrils, increase the muscle size. Muscular atrophy and muscular hypertrophy. Muscle hypertrophy, increase in the muscle fiber diameter due to production of more myofibrils. The protein synthesis inside the muscle is going to be increased, and this will form more myofibrils inside the muscle. Increase the formation of myofibrils will increase the muscle fiber diameter. So, with carrying weights for long time or the performance of forceful repetitive muscular activity by lifting weights is going to increase the diameter of the muscle fiber and producing more myofibrils. Muscular atrophy. Atrophy means that there is degenerative changes in the muscle. It is wasting type of the muscle fibers. It is a wasting of the muscle fibers, and this may occur due to denervation atrophy. Denervation atrophy, when the nerve supply of the muscle is cut, when the motor nerve supplying the muscle is cut, or disuse atrophy. Disuse atrophy occur when the muscle is not used. The muscle is not used as in bedridden patient or people with cast. That is the muscular atrophy. the muscle fiber decrease in size, and because of the progressive loss of the myofibrils, that is the degeneration in the muscle, either due to absence of the muscle use or absence of the nerve supply.